Australia is no stranger to horror stories, but few cases have gripped, horrified, and sickened the nation quite like the Snowtown murders.
Because those memories are just too hurtful for me to talk about, and especially the way he got tortured and what he got put through, body parts cut off.
What started as a quiet investigation into a missing person spiraled into one of the most disturbing discoveries in Australian criminal history. Bodies decomposing inside barrels, hidden in a disused bank vault. This is the full, brutal story of the Snowtown barrel murders, the beginning of a nightmare. Started in the late 1990s when police began investigating a series of suspicious disappearances around Adelaide's northern suburbs. On the surface, there was no clear pattern, but quietly a few names kept surfacing again and again, including a man called John Bunting. Bunting was no criminal mastermind. He was a charismatic, manipulative thug who presented himself as a protector, someone who hated pedophiles and those he considered weak. But underneath that mask was pure evil. He gathered around him a loyal group: Robert Wagner, James Vlasakis, and Mark Hayden. Together, they didn't just kill, they tortured, humiliated, and systematically destroyed lives, often people they knew personally. A house of horror. Inside Bunting's home at 11 Waterloo Corner Road in Salisbury North, the air stank of rot and cruelty. Walls were decorated with twisted trophies, Polaroid photos of victims, personal belongings of the dead kept like grotesque souvenirs. Torture sessions were planned, discussed casually over tea. Victims were lured in, sometimes friends, sometimes even family, accused of being pedophiles, gay, or simply seen as weak or useless. They were tortured for hours, even days. Burns, beatings, electrocution. Bunting and his gang forced victims to recite humiliating confessions on tape while being tortured, sometimes impersonating fake phone calls to Centrelink to keep claiming the dead person's welfare payments after their murder. The cruelty was methodical, and money became a driving motive. The barrels of death. In 1999, after years of suspicion and investigative work, police finally closed in. Their search led them to a disused state bank building in Snowtown, a remote, almost ghostly town north of Adelaide. Inside the old vault, investigators made a discovery that even the most seasoned officers would never forget. 6 large plastic barrels, sealed shut, leaking a foul, stomach-churning odor. When they opened them, the horror was revealed. Human remains dissolved and bloated in acid, limbs twisted unnaturally, flesh a sloughing off bone. Each barrel contained bodies, mutilated, decomposing victims reduced to grotesque, liquefied forms. In total, police linked 12 murders to the Snowtown group. 8 of the bodies were found in the barrels. Others were buried elsewhere. The bodies were so badly degraded that identification became a nightmarish process. Pathologists worked day and night reconstructing skeletons and matching remains with missing persons. Who were the victims? The victims weren't random strangers. They were vulnerable people, acquaintances, friends, sometimes even family of the killers. Barry Lane, a former partner of Wagner, known to be openly gay. Michael Gardner, a cross-dresser targeted for his sexuality. Elizabeth Hayden, the wife of accomplice Mark Hayden, murdered to stop her from talking. Fred Brooks, a young man with an intellectual disability, tortured for days. Gavin Porter, a friend who made the mistake of sharing a car ride with Bunting. And horrifyingly, John Bunting encouraged his young protege, James Vlasakis, to kill his own half-brother, Troy Udy. It was murder fueled by hatred, greed, and a total absence of empathy. The gory details, how they died. Torture wasn't just incidental to the killings, it was the point. Victims were restrained, beaten with blunt objects, subjected to electric shocks with jumper leads, strangled slowly over hours. One man was injected with drain cleaner. Another was bludgeoned and dismembered while still barely alive. The killers took sick pleasure in extracting PIN numbers from their victims through violence. They'd force them to confess to crimes they often hadn't committed. And then, when the killers were done, the bodies were hacked apart, sometimes cooked to break down flesh faster before being stuffed into the acid-filled barrels. This was a horror show, calculated, monstrous, and utterly depraved. The arrests. When police moved in, they found more than just the barrels. They uncovered evidence that the group had meticulously planned their crimes. Lists of potential future victims, recordings of torture sessions, welfare fraud documentation. John Bunting was arrested along with Robert Wagner, James Vlasakis, and Mark Hayden. Their capture ended one of the darkest chapters in Australian crime history, but the aftermath would haunt the country for years. The trial. The Snowtown trial became the longest and most expensive criminal trial in Australian history. Lasting nearly 12 months, it exposed the depths of cruelty that shocked even the most hardened court officials who thought they'd seen everything. James Vlasakis turned witness for the prosecution, detailing the brutality he had helped inflict, and describing Bunting's ability to manipulate those around him. Ultimately, John Bunting was convicted of 11 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Robert Wagner was also convicted and sentenced to life without parole. James Vlasakis received a life sentence but with the possibility of parole after 26 years. Mark Hayden was convicted of assisting in covering up the murders, but not of direct involvement in killing. The legacy. Snowtown, once a forgotten rural town, became infamous overnight. The building where the barrels were found was demolished. Locals, furious at their town's name being forever linked to horror, campaigned unsuccessfully to have the town renamed. To this day, Snowtown carries a chilling weight across Australia, a symbol of pure, festering evil hiding in plain sight. The Snowtown murders weren't just about killing, they were about control, hatred, greed, and a complete disregard for human life. They exposed failures in social systems that left vulnerable people isolated and unprotected. And they remain a chilling reminder that monsters often wear the face of ordinary neighbors. 12 innocent lives were ended in the most horrific ways imaginable. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not just for the horror of their deaths, but for the cruelty and indifference that allowed their killers to operate for so long. If you want to hear more of the darkest true crime cases, the ones they don't always talk about, make sure you like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell to stay updated with the Grim Crim Vault.